Christmas night is supposed to be warm, forgiving, a time when family closes ranks. But that night I stood in the doorway holding a coat I had not planned to wear, listening as my own son explained why I could no longer stay under his roof. His voice careful and rehearsed, his wife silent beside him, eyes cold, already counting the inconvenience of my presence because they had just learned I had lost my job. And in that single moment, I stopped being a father and became a liability, a problem to be removed before it ruined their perfect holiday. And as the door closed behind me, I realized something far more painful than the winter air. They had already decided my worth long before that night, long before Christmas lights or excuses or sympathy. And standing there, I understood this was not just rejection, it was betrayal, dressed up as practicality, humiliation, wrapped in polite words. And they truly believed I had nowhere left to go, no options, no leverage, no future beyond whatever pity they were willing to spare. What they could not see was that this moment was not my end, but the beginning of something they never imagined. Because while they congratulated themselves on being practical and decisive, I was already holding on to a secret that would unravel every assumption they had made about me. A secret that would turn their certainty into panic and their cruelty into regret. And if you stay with me, you will see how one Christmas night exposed the truth about family loyalty and respect. How being pushed aside became my greatest advantage, and how the plan they never saw coming would quietly and completely change everything. My name is James Caldwell. I'm 65 years old, a retired high school history teacher who spent 37 years helping young minds understand that the past isn't just dates and battles, it's the story of human choices repeated across generations. My wife Margaret passed away 3 years ago. And since then, I've learned that grief doesn't fade. It simply finds new places to live inside you. The drive to Daniel's house took 40 minutes through light snow, the kind that dusts everything in white without making the roads dangerous. I kept the radio off, preferring the quiet hum of the engine and my own thoughts. In the passenger seats had a small wrapped box containing a leather journal that had belonged to Margaret. She used to write in it every morning before sunrise, filling pages with observations about birds, weather, and the small victories of ordinary life. I thought Emily might appreciate having something that carried her grandmother's handwriting, her presence. The girl was only 12, but she had Margaret's curiosity, that same way of tilting her head when something interested her. Daniel's house sat in a newer subdivision, west of Denver, all beige stucco and identical mailboxes. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Lauren's car was already there, which meant she'd come home early from work. That should have been my first warning. Lauren never left work early for anything. Daniel opened the door before I could knock. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from sleepless conversations rather than physical labor. "Dad," he said, stepping aside. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, son." I handed him a bottle of wine I'd brought and stepped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasting meat, sounds of holiday music playing softly from somewhere in the kitchen. Emily came running from the living room and wrapped her arms around my waist. "Grandpa, you came." "Of course I came," I said, hugging her back. "I wouldn't miss Christmas with my favorite granddaughter." "I'm your only granddaughter," she giggled. "That's why you're my favorite." Lauren appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. Her smile was perfect practiced. "James, so glad you could make it." "Thank you for having me." She nodded once, then returned to the kitchen without another word. I'd known Lauren for 15 years, watched her marry my son, watched her raise my granddaughter. In all that time, I never quite understood what lived behind her eyes. Margaret used to say Lauren calculated affection the way accountants calculated interest, precisely and always with an expected return. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The turkey was excellent, the conversation light. I mentioned that I'd officially retired last month earlier than planned, due to some health concerns my doctor wanted me to take seriously. Nothing dramatic, just the usual reminders that 65-year-old hearts need more rest than they once did. The moment I said the word retired, something shifted in Lauren's face. It was subtle, a flicker of something cold passing behind her eyes before the polite mask returned. Daniel suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes, avoiding my gaze entirely. Health concerns? Lauren asked, her voice carefully neutral. Nothing serious, I hope. Just precautionary, I said. The doctor recommended I slow down and enjoy life a little more. That's wise, she said, but her tone suggested she was thinking about something else entirely. Midway through dinner, Lauren's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then excused herself, walking toward the hallway. I heard fragments of her whispered conversation drifting back. I know, Mom. I'll handle it. When she returned, her demeanor had hardened further, though she tried to hide it with another practiced smile. After dessert, Emily helped me carry dishes to the kitchen. As we stood at the sink, she tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Grandpa, Mom said, you don't have money anymore. Is that true?" I looked down at her innocent face, her brow furrowed with confusion and concern that no 12-year-old should carry. "Where did you hear that, sweetheart? She was talking to Daddy last night." She said, "Now that you're not working, you're going to need help. She said you might become she struggled with the word, a burden." I patted her hand gently. "Don't worry about grown-up talk, Emily. Everything's fine." But as I watched Daniel across the room, still refusing to meet my eyes, and Lauren studying me with that calculating gaze, I understood something with sudden terrible clarity. This wasn't a family Christmas. This was an evaluation planned and coordinated before I ever walked through that door. The only question was what verdict they had already reached. We returned to the dining room for coffee and pie, though my appetite had vanished somewhere between Emily's whispered words and the look on my son's face. The Christmas lights on the tree blinked in cheerful patterns that felt increasingly absurd against the tension settling over the table like fog. Lauren poured coffee with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every movement. She placed a cup in front of me, then sat down and folded her hands on the tablecloth. The gesture reminded me of a prosecutor preparing opening remarks. "James." She began, her voice warm, but somehow empty. "We've been meaning to talk to you about some practical matters. With the holidays and everything, it never seemed like the right time, but since you mentioned your retirement tonight, maybe this is a good opportunity." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, feeling its heat against my palms. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Well, you know how expensive things have gotten. The mortgage alone is almost $4,000 a month now. Interest rates went up twice this year." She shook her head with theatrical concern. "In Emily's school tuition, we want to give her the best education possible. But Westbrook Academy isn't cheap. $18,000 a year, and that doesn't include uniforms, field trips, all the extras." Daniel nodded along, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. He hadn't looked at me directly since I'd arrived. His silence was its own kind of statement. "Then there's my business loan," Lauren continued. "I took out a significant amount to expand the consulting firm last spring. The payments are substantial, but it's an investment in our future, our family's future." She emphasized the word "our" in a way that somehow excluded me from its meaning. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. 37 years of teaching had taught me the value of patience, of letting people reveal themselves through their own words. Lauren was building towards something, and I wanted to see the full architecture before I responded. "What I'm trying to say," she went on, "is that we're stretched thin. Daniel works incredibly hard, but there's only so much one income can do when I'm reinvesting everything back into the business. We have to be strategic about every dollar." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from Thomas Reed, my oldest friend and attorney. "Call me when you're free. Important updates on the documents we discussed." I read it without expression, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Lauren's eyes followed the movement, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen, but I'd already darkened it. "Everything okay?" she asked, a note of suspicion threading through her concern. "Just a holiday greeting from an old friend," I said. "Nothing urgent." She studied me for a moment, then continued her prepared speech. "James, I want to be honest with you because I respect you. You were a high school teacher for nearly 4 decades. That's admirable, truly. But let's be realistic. Teachers don't exactly retire wealthy. No significant pension plan, no investment portfolio, probably just Social Security and whatever you manage to save." She paused, letting the words settle. "We have to think about the future, all of our futures." I noticed she said, "We have to think," rather than, "We want to help you." The distinction was small, but significant. Every sentence she spoke was technically polite, even caring on the surface. But beneath each word lay a harder truth. She was calculating my worth and finding the sum insufficient. Daniel finally spoke, though he addressed his coffee cup rather than me. "Lauren's right, Dad. Things are just really tight right now. We're not trying to be harsh, but we need to be practical." I looked at my son, searching for the boy who used to sit on my shoulders at football games, who cried when his goldfish died, who called me at midnight when Margaret passed, because he couldn't bear to be alone with his grief. That boy had grown into a man who couldn't meet his father's eyes while his wife dismantled whatever remained of our relationship. "I understand," I said quietly. "Times are difficult for everyone." Lauren seemed momentarily surprised by my lack of resistance. Perhaps she had expected arguments, defensiveness, the pride of an old man unwilling to face his diminished circumstances. Instead, I gave her nothing to push against. Emily appeared in the doorway, yawning. "Mommy, I'm tired. Can I open one present before bed? Please." Lauren's expression softened into something approaching genuine warmth. The only time I'd seen it all evening. One present, then straight to bed. "We have a big day tomorrow." As Emily ran to the tree, Lauren turned back to me. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care and said, "Dad, we need to have a serious conversation, just the 3 of us." After Emily goes to bed, the Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking. Somewhere in the house, Emily squealed with delight over her early present, and I sat there understanding with perfect clarity that whatever came next would not be a conversation at all, but a sentencing. I had no power to appeal. We waited in silence while Emily finished her excited examination of the gift, a new drawing tablet she'd been wanting. And then Lauren ushered her upstairs with promises of Santa's arrival. I listened to their footsteps ascending, Emily's voice, chattering about what other presents might be waiting, until a door closed somewhere above us and the house fell quiet. Lauren returned to the living room and sat across from me in the armchair Margaret had always admired during her visits. Daniel positioned himself on the couch close to his wife, but angled slightly away from me, as though proximity to her offered protection from whatever guilt might otherwise reach him. James, Lauren began, and this time there was no pretense of warmth, no careful diplomacy cushioning her words. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you deserve honesty. You're a financial risk." The words hung in the air, stark and cold. "If something happens to you?" She continued, "A fall, a stroke, dementia, anything that requires long-term care, we can't afford to take care of you. Do you have any idea what assisted living costs these days? Nursing homes, even basic home health aides, are $40 an hour. And that's just for someone to help you bathe and take your medications. We have our own future to protect Emily's future." I sat very still, absorbing the impact of each sentence. In all my years of teaching, I had witnessed cruelty in many forms. Children mocking each other, parents neglecting their responsibilities, administrators sacrificing teachers for political convenience. But there was something uniquely painful about hearing your own daughter-in-law reduce your existence to a line item in a budget spreadsheet. Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, it's not personal. he said, still unable to look at me. We've talked about this a lot, and we just have to be realistic. The mortgage, Emily's education at Westbrook Lawrence business expansion. It's all connected. One unexpected expense could throw everything off. We can't afford to carry extra weight right now. Extra weight. That's what I had become. Not a father, not a grandfather, not a man who had spent his life trying to build something meaningful, just extra weight threatening to sink their carefully constructed financial vessel. Lauren nodded approvingly at Daniel's contribution, then leaned forward in her chair. My mom always said something that stuck with me. Security comes first, family second. It sounds harsh, but she was right. You can't take care of anyone else if you haven't secured your own foundation first. That's all we're doing here, James. Securing our foundation. I filed that phrase away, noting how easily Lauren invoked her mother's philosophy, how naturally it seemed to guide her thinking. Margaret had met Barbara Hale only once at Daniel and Lauren's wedding. Afterward, she'd said something I hadn't fully understood at the time. That woman looks at people the way bankers look at loan applications. Now, 15 years later, I understood exactly what she meant. Lauren's phone rang from the kitchen, and she excused herself to answer it. The moment she disappeared around the corner, Daniel shifted closer to me. His face suddenly urgent, conflicted. "Dad!" He whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. Just trust me. Please." Before I could respond, before I could ask what he meant or what exactly I was supposed to trust, we heard Lauren's heels clicking back toward the living room. Daniel retreated to his position on the couch, his expression smoothing back into careful neutrality. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned slightly and saw Emily standing in the hallway shadows just outside the living room door. She must have crept back downstairs while her mother was on the phone. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her small hands pressed against her mouth to muffle any sound. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw in her face a grief that no 12-year-old should ever have to carry, the grief of watching adults destroy something sacred while pretending it was merely practical. I gave her the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement, then turned back toward the living room. I would not expose her presence. Whatever she heard tonight, she would process in her own time, in her own way. Lauren returned, sliding her phone into her pocket. She remained standing this time, looking down at me with an expression that had hardened into something final. "James, I've been thinking about this, and honestly, we believe it's better if you don't stay here tonight." She glanced at Daniel, who nodded weakly. "We need space to think about next steps, about how to move forward as a family. Having you here right now just complicates things." I understood then that this had always been the plan. The dinner, the conversation, the careful build-up. It was all choreographed to arrive at this precise moment. They weren't asking me to leave because they needed space to think. They were asking me to leave because they had already finished thinking, and their conclusion required my absence. "I see," I said, quietly. The Christmas tree lights continued their mechanical blinking, indifferent to the wreckage being assembled beneath their glow. And somewhere in the hallway, hidden in shadows, a little girl learned exactly how fragile the word family could become. I stood up slowly, not because my body required the extra time, but because I wanted them to see that I was choosing to leave rather than being forced. There is a difference between retreat and surrender, and I intended to demonstrate it clearly. "I understand," I said, my voice steady. "I'll gather my things." Lauren's expression flickered with something like surprise, perhaps even disappointment. She had prepared herself for resistance, for arguments, for the messy, emotional confrontation that would justify her position. Instead, I offered her nothing but quiet acceptance, and somehow that seemed to unsettle her more than any protest could have. I walked to the hallway closet and retrieved my coat. As I pulled it on, I noticed the small, wrapped box sitting on the entry table, The leather journal I had brought for Emily, the one that had belonged to Margaret. Someone had placed it there returned, and rejected the ribbon still perfectly tied. I picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. Margaret had written in this journal every morning for 12 years. Her thoughts, her observations, her private conversations with herself were pressed between these pages. I had wanted Emily to have something real, something that connected her to a grandmother she barely remembered. But apparently even this small inheritance was too much of a burden. I slipped the journal into my coat pocket without comment. Daniel appeared beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders curved inward, like a man bracing against wind that wasn't there. "Dad," he said, his voice hollow and mechanical. "I'll call you tomorrow. I promise we'll figure something out." I looked at my son, searching for conviction in his words, and finding none. He was going through motions, reciting lines from a script his wife had written. The boy who used to tell me everything, who trusted me with his fears and dreams, had become Snorts, a man who couldn't even lie convincingly. "Take care of Emily," I said. It was the only thing I could think to say that wouldn't crack the careful composure I had built around myself. He nodded relief washing over his features at the simple request. "I will, Dad." "Of course I will." I opened the front door and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Flakes drifted down through the glow of the porch light, settling on my shoulders, my hair the walkway before me. Christmas Eve had become Christmas morning somewhere in the past hour. Though the celebration felt very far away, the door closed behind me with a soft click. I did not hear it lock, but I felt the finality of the sound nonetheless. I walked down the driveway, my footsteps crunching softly in the thin layer of accumulating snow, and pulled out my phone. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "James, is everything all right, Thomas?" I said quietly. "It's happening just as she predicted." There was a pause on the other end, heavy with understanding. "I see. Are you safe? I'm fine. We'll talk tomorrow." "Tomorrow then?" And James, she knew what she was doing. Trust the process. I ended the call and stood for a moment in the silence of the sleeping neighborhood. Christmas lights blinked from roof lines and windows up and down the street, their cheerful patterns at odds with the hollow space expanding in my chest. A taxi turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the falling snow, and pulled to a stop at the end of the driveway. Not a ride share with an amateur driver and questionable navigation, but a proper cab with a professional behind the wheel. I opened the rear door but paused before climbing in. Something made me turn and look back at the house one final time. The windows glowed with warm light. The Christmas tree was visible through the front curtains, still blinking its mechanical joy. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a home filled with families celebrating the holiday together. No one passing by would ever guess what had just transpired inside those walls. I waited to feel something. Anger, perhaps grief, the sting of betrayal, or the heat of resentment. But there was nothing. Just the cold air against my face and the snow melting in my hair, and a strange empty calm that settled over me like a blanket. I climbed into the taxi and pulled the door shut. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Maple Street, please." "The small apartment complex on the corner." He nodded and pulled away from the curb. I watched Daniel's house shrink in the rear window until we turned a corner and it disappeared entirely. The journal pressed against my chest from inside my coat pocket. Margaret's words waiting patiently in the darkness. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in white, erasing footprints and tire tracks, and all evidence of where anyone had been. The apartment on Maple Street was exactly what it appeared to be, a modest one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The furniture came with the rental, a worn couch in muted brown, a kitchen table with two mismatched chairs, a bed frame that creaked when you sat on it. The walls were painted the color of old cream, and the single window in the living room looked out over a parking lot, and beyond that, the distant lights of downtown Denver. I spent Christmas morning unpacking the small bag I had brought, hanging my spare clothes in a closet that smelled faintly of mothballs and previous tenants. The leather journal sat on the nightstand beside the bed, Margaret's handwriting waiting inside like a conversation postponed. By afternoon, I called Thomas. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular concern of a friend who has known you long enough to hear what you don't say. "I'm fine," I told him. "But I need to discuss my financial situation. Review my options going forward, of course." "What are you thinking?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I need to be realistic about my circumstances, Thomas. A teacher's retirement doesn't stretch far these days. I'm wondering about borrowing money for long-term rent, something to bridge the gap until I figure out a more permanent solution." There was silence on the other end, the kind that suggested Thomas was weighing how much to say. "James, you know Margaret left something for you, but she was very specific about the timing. She said only when the time is right." "And when is that?" "When you're ready to stop hiding," he said quietly. Her words, not mine. "She knew you better than anyone, James. She planned for this." I didn't ask him to elaborate. Margaret had always seen further than I could anticipated storms before clouds even formed on the horizon. If she had left instructions, there was a reason for their timing. My job was simply to trust her even now, even 3 years after she had stopped breathing. "I understand," I said. "We'll talk more soon." The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of quiet routine. I walked to the small grocery store 2 blocks away and bought simple provisions: bread, eggs, coffee, canned soup. I read books I'd been meaning to finish for years. I watched the news with detached interest, observing the world continue its spinning while mine had temporarily paused. On December 28th, my phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long time before reading it. "Dad, Lauren won't let me call you. I'm sorry. Please understand." I read the message twice, noting the passive construction, the way he positioned himself as helpless rather than complicit. "Lauren won't let me." As though he were a child asking permission rather than a 40-year-old man capable of making his own choices. He had chosen his wife over his father. And perhaps that was natural. Perhaps that was how it should be. But he lacked the courage to own that choice, and that bothered me more than the choice itself. I did not reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either comfort him falsely or wound him needlessly. Some silences are kinder than words. New Year's Eve arrived wrapped in bitter cold and clear skies. I sat by the window in the small living room, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and watched the distant explosions of color over downtown. Fireworks burst and faded, each celebration lasting only seconds before dissolving into smoke and memory. People were gathered somewhere beneath those lights, counting down, kissing, making promises they might or might not keep. I sat alone in my borrowed apartment and felt no self-pity, no longing for what I didn't have. Only patience, the deep-rooted patience of a man who has learned that time reveals everything eventually. Margaret used to say that waiting was its own kind of action. Most people think patience means doing nothing, she would tell me during our walks along the river. But real patience is active. It's holding steady when everything around you says move. It's trusting the process even when you can't see the destination. I hadn't fully understood her then. I was beginning to understand now. The fireworks reached their crescendo around midnight, a final barrage of light and sound that rattled the windows and set off car alarms in the parking lot below. Then silence returned deeper than before, and the new year officially began. My phone rang just after 1 hour in the morning. Thomas's name glowed on the screen. "Happy New Year," I said, answering. "James, I'm sorry to call so late." His voice was different, now sharper, carrying an edge of urgency I had rarely heard from him. "There's something you should know about Lauren's family. I've been doing some digging these past few days, following up on some things Margaret mentioned years ago. I found information I wasn't expecting." I sat up straighter, the tea forgotten. "What kind of information about her mother, about the pattern?" He paused, and I could hear him gathering his thoughts, organizing the revelation he was about to deliver. "James, you're going to want to hear this. And then, you're going to want to decide what we do next." Outside, the last wisps of fireworks, smoke drifted across the stars. And somewhere in the distance, people were still celebrating the arrival of a year they believed would bring them happiness. I listened to Thomas breathe on the other end of the line and understood that whatever came next would change everything. Thomas arrived at the Maple Street apartment the following afternoon, carrying a folder thick with documents and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept much since our phone call. I made coffee in the small kitchen while he spread papers across the table, organizing them into neat piles that represented different threads of whatever story he had uncovered. "Before we begin," I said, setting 2 cups between the documents, "I need to tell you something about why I've lived the way I have. Why Margaret and I made certain choices that might seem strange to people who didn't know our history." Thomas looked up from his papers, giving me his full attention. "My father died when I was 11 years old." I said the words carrying weight even after all these decades. "Heart attack. He was 43. The doctor said it was stress over work. A body pushed past its limits by a man who believed providing for his family meant sacrificing himself for them. He worked double shifts at the factory, picked up weekend jobs, rarely slept more than 5 hours a night. My mother used to beg him to slow down, but he always said the same thing. When we have enough, I'll rest. He never reached enough. He just reached the end." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding beginning to form in his eyes. "After he died, my mother raised me alone. We had nothing. No savings, no insurance, nothing but debt, and the small salary she earned cleaning houses. Money became this thing that haunted every decision. We couldn't afford school supplies, so I learned to make do. We couldn't afford doctors, so I learned to ignore pain. By the time I was old enough to work, I swore I would never let my family experience that kind of desperation again." I paused, taking a sip of coffee that had already grown cold. "When Margaret and I found success, when the investments paid off, and the fund grew beyond anything we had imagined, we made a pact. Wealth would never define our relationships. We had seen what the pursuit of money did to my father, and we had seen what the absence of money did to my mother. We didn't want either extreme for our family, so we lived simply on purpose. We kept the teaching job, the modest house, the ordinary life. Daniel grew up believing his parents were comfortable but unremarkable. We wanted him to build his character without the crutch of inheritance or the burden of expectation." Thomas was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. A woman in her early 60s stared back at me. Blonde hair, perfectly styled smile, perfectly calculated. Something in her eyes reminded me of Lauren. The same appraising quality, the same sense that every interaction was being measured for profit. "This is Barbara Hale," Thomas said. "Lauren's mother. I've spent the past week looking into her background, and what I found is illuminating." "Tell me." "Barbara has quite a reputation in Arizona real estate circles. She built a career on what people politely call strategic positioning. Less politely, she's known for identifying wealthy, older men, usually widowers or divorcees, and positioning her daughters to marry them. Lauren wasn't her first project." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. There were others. An older sister, Victoria, married a retired surgeon in Scottsdale 8 years ago. The marriage lasted 3 years, ended in divorce, and Victoria walked away with a significant settlement. Before that, there was another daughter from Barbara's first marriage who married into a family with commercial real estate holdings in Phoenix. That marriage also ended conveniently. Thomas paused. Barbara doesn't just advise her daughters on relationships, she architects them. The picture was becoming clearer now, the individual pieces connecting into a pattern I should have recognized years ago. Lauren's coldness wasn't personal. It was professional. I was never a father-in-law to her. I was a target that had somehow failed to produce the expected return. There's something else, Thomas continued, his voice more cautious now. Something I wasn't sure whether to mention, but I think you need to know. Go on. Daniel called me last week before Christmas, actually. He asked strange questions about Margaret's trust, how it was structured, what conditions were attached, who the beneficiaries were. Questions a son shouldn't need to ask unless he already knows something. I sat very still, processing this information. Daniel had known enough to ask questions, but hadn't known enough to answer them himself, which meant Margaret had told him something, perhaps not everything, but enough to make him curious, enough to make him complicit in whatever was unfolding. What exactly did you tell him? I asked. Nothing specific. Attorney-client privilege, even with family, but his question suggested he was trying to understand the timeline of when certain things might activate. I nodded slowly, adding this piece to the puzzle. Daniel's whispered words on Christmas Eve, "Trust me," took on new significance. Perhaps he wasn't as passive as he appeared. Perhaps he was playing a longer game than I had given him credit for. Thomas gathered the remaining documents and slid them toward me. There's one more thing, James, and this is why I called you last night. Lauren's already investigating you. She contacted 3 of your former colleagues at the high school, asked about your retirement package, your pension, whether you had ever mentioned investments or outside income. And what did they tell her? What you wanted them to believe all these years, that you were just a teacher living on a teacher's salary. Thomas leaned forward, his expression grave. But Lauren's not stupid. She knows something doesn't add up. A man who asks about borrowing money for rent doesn't receive calls from attorneys in the middle of the night. She's getting desperate, James. And desperate people make dangerous moves. The day after Thomas revealed the depth of Lauren's investigation, he called and asked me to meet him at his office downtown. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, something between solemnity and anticipation, as though he had been waiting to make this call for a very long time. His office occupied the corner of a building that had stood in Denver since before either of us were born. The wooden floors creaked with history, and the walls were lined with law books that had accumulated across 3 generations of practice. Thomas sat behind his desk, but he wasn't looking at case files or legal briefs. He was looking at a single envelope resting on the leather blot in front of him. "Sit down, James," he said quietly. "There's something I've been holding for you, something Margaret asked me to give you, but only when certain conditions were met." I lowered myself into the chair across from him, my eyes fixed on that envelope. Even from where I sat, I could see the handwriting on the front, Margaret's graceful script, the way she curved her letters like small works of art. My name was written there, just James, the way she always addressed her notes to me. Thomas slid the envelope across the desk. "She gave this to me 5 years ago, about 6 months before she passed. She was very specific about the timing. She said, I would know when you were ready and that you would know why it mattered." I picked up the envelope with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. The paper was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind Margaret used for important correspondence. It was sealed with a small wax stamp, her personal seal, the one I'd given her for our 30th anniversary. The flap had never been opened. "I've never read it," Thomas said. "She asked me not to. Whatever is inside, it's meant only for you." I turned the envelope over and broke the seal carefully, preserving as much of the wax as possible. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, covered in Margaret's handwriting. The date at the top read January 15th, 5 years and 1 week before this moment. I began to read. My dearest James. The letter began, and I could hear her voice in every word, that gentle cadence she used when she had something important to say. If you're reading this, then something has happened. Someone has hurt you. Probably someone we trusted. Someone we welcomed into our family. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you never need to open this envelope and that Thomas eventually returns it to you as a curiosity from an overly cautious wife. But if I'm right, then I need you to understand that I saw it coming and I prepared. My throat tightened. I forced myself to continue. I always worried about Lauren. Always worried about. From the first time Daniel brought her home, there was something calculating in her eyes. She smiled at all the right moments and said all the right things, but her warmth never quite reached beyond her face. I tried to tell myself I was being unfair, that I was simply being protective of our son. But mothers know things, James. We see patterns that others miss. And the pattern I saw in Lauren was one of measurement. She was always measuring, always calculating the value of everything and everyone around her. I paused to steady my breathing, then read on, "Watch your mother, Barbara." The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I met her only once at the wedding, but once was enough. She looked at our family the way investors look at portfolios, assessing risk, estimating return. If Lauren ever turns against you, know that the blueprint came from her mother. They are cut from the same cloth. James, they see love as leverage. The letter continued on the reverse side. I've prepared everything. Thomas will explain when you're ready, not before. Because you would have tried to change things, and some lessons can only be learned by living through them. I created a trust structured with conditions that only Thomas knows. Conditions that will reveal who truly loves you and who merely loves what you represent. The details are complex, but the purpose is simple: to protect you when I no longer can, and to give Daniel one final chance to prove who he really is. My hands were trembling now, the paper shaking slightly as I neared the end. Trust Thomas as you trusted me. He has been our friend for 40 years, and he carries this burden because I asked him to. Whatever happens next, remember that I loved you from the moment we met until the moment I left, and that love doesn't end just because breath does. I am still with you, James. I will always be with you, and I will not let anyone destroy what we built together. All my love forever and always, Margaret. Always. I sat in silence for a long time, the letter resting in my lap. Hairs I hadn't expected sliding down my cheeks. She had seen everything. The coldness behind Lauren's smile, the danger in Barbara's influence, even the possibility that Daniel might one day fail the test of loyalty. 5 years before any of it happened, Margaret had looked into the future and prepared a shield for the husband she would leave behind. I thought of all the mornings she had spent at her desk. All the quiet conversations with Thomas I had assumed were about estate planning or charity work. She had been building this layer by layer, provision by provision, while pretending everything was normal. She had carried this knowledge alone because she knew I would have confronted it directly, would have tried to fix what wasn't yet broken. I looked up at Thomas, my vision still blurred with tears. "I'm ready?" I said, my voice rough but certain. "Tell me everything Margaret planned." Thomas spent the following days explaining the architecture of Margaret's plan, the trusts, the conditions, the careful legal framework she had constructed to protect me. But he also maintained a quiet surveillance of the other side contacts and connections that allowed us to monitor what Lauren was doing in response to my disappearance. On the morning of January 7th, he arrived at the modest apartment where I was still staying, part of the misdirection Margaret had outlined with news that carried a certain grim satisfaction. "She went to Maple Street yesterday," Thomas said, settling into the worn couch. "Knocked on the door of the apartment where you were supposed to be staying. The landlord told her you moved out 3 days ago." No forwarding address, no explanation. I poured coffee for both of us and sat across from him. How did she react? According to my source, she stood in that hallway for nearly 10 minutes just staring at the door. Then, she made a phone call, couldn't hear what was said, but she was agitated, almost frantic. I nodded slowly. The Lauren I knew was someone who maintained rigid control over every situation. Discovering that control had slipped would be deeply unsettling for her. Over the following days, Thomas pieced together a picture of Lauren's increasingly desperate investigation. She had called at least 3 of my former colleagues at the high school, asking questions about my retirement circumstances, my pension, whether I had ever mentioned investments or property. Each colleague told her the same story, the one I had cultivated for decades. James Caldwell was a dedicated teacher, lived modestly, probably had a small savings account and not much else. But the answers didn't satisfy her. Something had triggered her suspicion, and that something wouldn't let her rest. She hired a private investigator, Thomas reported on January 10th, a man named Sullivan who operates out of an office in Aurora. He's been running background checks, searching public records, trying to trace any assets in your name. Will he find anything? Thomas smiled thinly. Margaret was thorough. Everything significant is held through trusts and holding companies, none of which trace directly to your name. Sullivan will find a retired teacher with a modest bank account and a 15-year-old Honda. Nothing more. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt something closer to sadness. Lauren was chasing shadows, burning money on investigations that would lead nowhere, all because she couldn't accept that she had misjudged her target. If she had simply been kind, if she had treated me as family rather than a financial liability, none of this would have mattered. The wealth would have remained invisible, irrelevant to our relationships. But she had revealed her nature, and now that nature was consuming her. On January 12th, something unexpected happened. Thomas arrived at my temporary location, a different apartment, now in a different part of the city, with an expression caught between amusement and concern. "Someone sent Lauren a photograph," he said, placing a copy on the table between us. I looked at the image. It showed a younger version of myself, perhaps 40 years old, standing in front of a large office building. I was wearing a suit, which was unusual enough, and shaking hands with a man I recognized as one of our early investors. The photograph was dated 1987, and someone had written a caption beneath it the year he started everything. "Who sent this?" I asked. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "It wasn't me, and as far as I can tell, it wasn't anyone connected to our circle. Someone else knows pieces of your history, James. Someone who wants Lauren to know that you're not what she assumed." I studied the photograph, trying to remember that day. It had been the opening of our first real office space, a celebration of a fund that would eventually grow beyond anything we had imagined. Margaret had taken the picture, I recalled. She had been proud that day. How did Lauren react? My contact says she's been barely sleeping. She called her mother that same night. A long conversation, very heated. The next morning, she made a plane reservation for herself. For Barbara, one-way ticket from Phoenix arriving tomorrow. I set the photograph down and leaned back in my chair. Barbara Hale was coming to Denver. The mastermind was entering the board, which meant the game was about to change fundamentally. Thomas had managed to obtain fragments of Lauren's phone call to her mother. Not the full conversation, but enough to understand its shape. Lauren's voice had been shaking, he said, stripped of its usual composure. "Mom, I think we made a terrible mistake. He's not who we thought he was. There's money somewhere, real money, and I can't find it." Barbara's response, by contrast, had been ice cold and controlled. "Calm down. Panic is for amateurs. You're acting like a child who lost her toy. I'm booking a flight tonight." "What do we do?" Lauren had asked. And then Barbara had said something that Thomas repeated to me with particular emphasis because it revealed everything about who these women really were. Whatever he's hiding, we'll find it. And when we do, we'll use it. That's what we've always done. I sat with those words for a long time after Thomas left. Barbara Hale wasn't coming to Denver to apologize or reconcile. She was coming to salvage a failing operation to find the treasure her daughter had been unable to locate and to extract whatever value remained from a Mark who had proven more complicated than expected. She didn't know that the Mark had been expecting her all along. Barbara Hale arrived in Denver on the morning of January 16th. Thomas had arranged for someone to observe her at the airport, a former colleague who owed him a favor, and the report came back exactly as expected. She walked through the terminal like a woman accustomed to controlling every room she entered. Her silver blonde hair perfectly styled her winter coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. Lauren met her at baggage claim, and even from a distance, the dynamic between them was visible. Lauren spoke rapidly, gesturing with nervous energy, while Barbara listened with the patient condescension of a teacher tolerating an underperforming student. They spent 3 days strategizing. Thomas monitored their movements through various channels, credit card activity, phone records that a judge had authorized based on preliminary fraud concerns, and the simple network of people who notice things in a city smaller than it pretends to be. On January 19th, Lauren called Thomas's office and requested a meeting. "We'd like to discuss James's estate and future care needs," she said, her voice carefully measured. "As his family, we feel it's important to understand his situation so we can provide appropriate support." Thomas agreed to meet them the following afternoon. He gave them an address downtown and told them to come to the 40th floor. I spent the morning of January 20th preparing. The penthouse had been mine and Margaret's for nearly 20 years. Though we rarely used it, a symbol of success we preferred to keep invisible. The living room offered floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furnished with pieces Margaret had selected during our travels. Her portrait hung above the fireplace, painted by an artist we'd met in Florence, capturing her in a moment of quiet thought that I had always loved. I dressed in a suit I hadn't worn in years, charcoal gray, with a subtle pinstripe, the kind of clothing that communicates wealth without announcing it. Then I stood by the windows and waited. Thomas greeted them in the lobby and escorted them up in the private elevator. I heard the doors open, heard the click of heels on marble, heard Lauren's sharp intake of breath as she took in the space. Then they appeared in the doorway of the living room. Lauren in a business dress that suggested she had prepared for negotiation. Barbara in something more elegant that suggested she had prepared for victory. I turned from the window to face them. "Welcome," I said. "I've been expecting you both." Lauren's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something approaching fear. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. She looked around the penthouse at the art on the walls, the view of the mountains in the distance, the portrait of Margaret watching over everything, and I could see her recalculating every assumption she had ever made about me. Barbara was faster to recover. Her expression barely flickered before smoothing into a practiced smile. "James," she said, stepping forward with her hand extended as though we were meeting at a charity gala. "What a beautiful home. I had no idea you were so comfortable." I didn't take her hand. "Please sit down. We have much to discuss." They settled onto the leather sofa, while Thomas took his position near the fireplace, a folder resting on his lap. I remained standing, positioned where the afternoon light fell across my shoulders. "I understand you wanted to discuss my estate and care needs," I said. "Allow me to clarify a few things. I am the silent founding partner of Ridgemont Capital, an investment fund established in 1987. I stepped back from active management 10 years ago, but retained significant holdings. My estimated net worth as of the most recent valuation is approximately $15 million. Lauren made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Barbara's smile tightened but did not disappear. I see, Barbara said, her voice steady. Well, this certainly changes things, James. Let's be reasonable here. We're family now. Whatever misunderstandings may have occurred, I'm sure we can find a way forward that benefits everyone. I studied her for a moment. This woman who had orchestrated her daughter's marriage like a business acquisition, who had trained Lauren to see relationships as transactions and people as resources. Margaret had been right about her. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. It had been carefully placed exactly where the tree intended. Thomas, I said, please show them what we found. Thomas opened his folder and produced a stack of printed pages. These are emails between the two of you, he said. Addressing Barbara and Lauren spanning the past 3 years, obtained legally, I should add through discovery processes related to a fraud investigation that was opened last week. He handed the first page to Lauren, who read it with trembling hands. Barbara reached over to see, and for the first time her composure cracked. This particular exchange is from 18 months ago, Thomas continued. Barbara writes, and I quote, "Once the old man dies, we liquidate everything. He's just a liability with a ticking clock. Make sure Daniel doesn't develop a conscience before then." Lauren responds, "Don't worry, Mom. I've got him under control." Lauren's face had gone pale. Barbara sat very still, her jaw tight, her eyes calculating escape routes that no longer existed. But here's what interested me most, Thomas said, producing another document. This email is from 6 years ago, before Daniel and Lauren were even engaged. Barbara writes to Lauren, "The Caldwell son is perfect. Father is a school teacher, but my source says there's family money somewhere. Old investments, possibly trusts. Play the long game. Make him love you first." I let the silence stretch. Lauren was crying now, silently, tears streaking her careful makeup. Barbara simply stared at the documents as though willpower alone could make them disappear. "You knew," I said to Barbara. "You knew about the money before Lauren ever met my son. You selected Daniel as a target and sent your daughter to secure him. The marriage, the 15 years, the child, all of it was strategy." Barbara finally met my eyes. Whatever warmth she had manufactured was gone, replaced by something cold and reptilian. "You can't prove intent," she said. "Emails can be misinterpreted. Any lawyer will tell you, I'm not interested in lawyers." I interrupted. "I'm interested in truth. And the truth is now clear to everyone in this room." I turned to Thomas and nodded. "Please," I said, "read them the conditions of Margaret's living trust." Thomas opened a second folder, this one containing documents bound with a blue legal backing. He stood and positioned himself near the fireplace directly beneath Margaret's portrait, as though drawing authority from her presence. Lauren and Barbara remained on the sofa, their earlier confidence shattered into fragments they were still trying to reassemble. Before her death, Thomas began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had delivered difficult truths in courtrooms for 40 years. Margaret Caldwell established what is known as a living trust. This is a legal instrument that allows assets to be managed and distributed according to specific conditions without the delays and public exposure of probate court. Barbara shifted impatiently. "We know what a living trust is." "Get to the point." Thomas ignored her interruption. "Margaret named me as the sole trustee, granting me full discretionary power over all distributions. This means that I, not the beneficiaries, not the courts, determine when and whether funds are released based on criteria Margaret established before her death." He turned a page in the document, letting the rustle of paper fill the silence. "The trust contains several standard provisions regarding James's care and comfort during his lifetime, but it also contains a clause that Margaret insisted upon when she drafted herself with considerable thought. Thomas looked directly at Lauren. I will read it verbatim. Lauren's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Barbara sat rigidly beside her, every muscle tensed, as though preparing for physical combat. Thomas read, any individual who demands requests or otherwise pressures James Caldwell to leave the home of a beneficiary within 5 years of my death with the intent to exclude him from family life or to diminish his role within the family structure shall immediately and permanently forfeit all rights to benefits from this trust. This forfeit shall extend to any assets, distributions, or inheritances that would otherwise pass to said individual, and no appeal or reversal shall be permitted regardless of subsequent behavior or expressed remorse. The words hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. Lauren's face drained of color, the full implications settling over her with crushing weight. She had demanded exactly what Margaret had anticipated. She had triggered the clause with her own words, her own choices, her own cruelty. That's absurd. Barbara said, her voice sharp but wavering. You can't enforce something like that. It's vague. It's subjective. Any competent attorney would tear it apart. Thomas smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Mrs. Hale, I've been practicing estate law for over 40 years. I assure you the language is precise, the conditions are clear, and the documentation of intent is thorough. Margaret anticipated challenges. She prepared for them documentation. Lauren whispered the word, barely audible. Thomas reached into his folder and produced a small device, a digital recorder. For the record, he said, Colorado is what's known as a one-party consent state. This means that any participant in a conversation may legally record that conversation without informing the other parties. James was a participant in every conversation that took place on Christmas Eve. He pressed a button, and Lauren's voice filled the penthouse clear and unmistakable. You're a financial risk. If something happens to you, a fall, dementia, anything, we can't afford to take care of you. Another clip. Daniel's voice hollow and compliant. We can't carry extra weight right now. And then Lauren again, the words that had sealed everything. Honestly, James, we think it's better if you don't stay here tonight. We need space to think. Thomas stopped the recording. Every word documented, every demand preserved. The intent to exclude James from family life is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. Lauren began to cry, not the theatrical tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the raw, ugly crying of someone watching their plans collapse into rubble. Barbara, however, rose to her feet, with sudden violence, her composure finally cracking. This is entrapment, she said, pointing a trembling finger at me. You planned this. You manipulated the situation to get exactly the response you wanted. No court in this country will accept evidence obtained through deliberate provocation. Thomas's smile remained fixed, patient, almost pitying. Mrs. Hale entrapment is a defense that applies to law enforcement officers who induce someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise have committed. James is not a law enforcement officer. He did not induce anyone to do anything. He simply attended Christmas dinner with his family and listened while his daughter-in-law demanded that he leave. He stepped closer to Barbara, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. It's not entrapment when you voluntarily reveal your character, Mrs. Hale. No one forced Lauren to say those words. No one compelled her to treat James as a liability rather than a father. She made those choices freely, and now those choices have consequences. He paused. Margaret always believed that people reveal who they truly are when they believe no one important is watching. She simply arranged for someone to be watching. Barbara sank back onto the sofa, her defiance collapsing into something smaller. For the first time since she had arrived in Denver, she looked her age, a woman in her 60s, whose lifetime of manipulation had finally encountered a wall it could not breach. Lauren was still crying, her mascara running in dark streams down her cheeks. What happens now? She managed between sobs. What does this mean for us? I remained silent. This was Thomas's stage, and he commanded it with the authority of a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment. What happens now, Thomas said, depends largely on choices that have not yet been made. The trust conditions are triggered, but the full implications are still being determined. He closed the folder and glanced toward the door that led to the penthouse's private entrance. There is one more matter to address, he said. Daniel contacted me yesterday. He asked to be present for this conversation, but he wanted to wait until certain things had been said. Thomas looked at me, and I nodded permission. He's been waiting outside for the past hour. He asked to address everyone before any final decisions are made. Lauren's head snapped up. Daniel is here. He arrived before you did, Thomas confirmed. He has something to say. Something he feels is long overdue. I watched Lauren's expression shift from shock to fear to desperate hope, each emotion flickering across her face like channels changing on a television. She didn't know what Daniel would say. She didn't know whose side he would take. And for the first time, she understood that her husband was not the passive puppet she had always believed him to be. Thomas walked to the door and opened it. The 5 days between the penthouse revelation and the formal meeting at Thomas's law office passed in tense silence. Daniel had entered that evening, had looked at his wife and mother-in-law with an expression I couldn't quite read, and had asked for time. I need to think, he had said. I need to understand what I'm going to do. Thomas had agreed to reconvene everyone on January 25th, giving all parties the opportunity to consult with their own attorneys and prepare whatever statements they wished to make. Now we sat in the conference room of Thomas's firm, a wood-paneled space with tall windows overlooking a courtyard dusted with January snow. Thomas occupied the head of the table, legal documents arranged before him with methodical precision. I sat to his right. Daniel had taken a chair at the far end, as though physical distance could insulate him from what was about to unfold. Lauren and Barbara sat together on the opposite side, their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Vance, positioned between them like a shield. Emily had been left at home with a babysitter. That was the official arrangement, the one everyone had agreed upon. A 12-year-old had no place in a meeting like this, surrounded by accusations and legal maneuvering and the wreckage of adult failures. But I noticed Daniel's phone resting face down on the table beside him, and I noticed the slight green glow along its edge that suggested an active call. I said nothing. If my son had made a choice about what his daughter should hear, that choice was his to make. Thomas opened the proceedings with a summary of events: the Christmas Eve conversation, the subsequent investigation, the trust conditions that had been triggered. His tone was neutral, factual, the voice of a man presenting evidence rather than rendering judgment. When he finished, he turned to Lauren's attorney. Mrs. Vance, your clients requested this meeting. The floor is yours. Patricia Vance straightened her papers with practiced efficiency. Thank you. My clients wish to state for the record that they believe these proceedings are fundamentally unfair. The recordings Mr. Reed has presented were obtained without my client's knowledge or consent. Colorado is a one-party consent state, Thomas interjected mildly. The recordings are entirely legal. Legal and ethical are not always the same thing, Vance countered. Furthermore, my clients have reason to believe the recordings may have been edited or manipulated to present a misleading narrative. We request that the original unedited files be submitted for independent forensic analysis. Thomas nodded as though he had expected exactly this argument. I anticipated that concern. He produced a laptop and connected it to a screen mounted on the wall. What I am about to play is the complete unedited recording from Christmas Eve. Runtime is 47 minutes. The file has been authenticated by a certified digital forensics expert, whose report is included in the materials before you. He pressed play. Lauren's voice filled the room, crisp and clear through the speakers. The recording began with casual dinner conversation compliments on the food discussion of Emily's school activities, the mundane exchanges of a family gathering. Then it shifted gradually at first, then with increasing sharpness toward the conversation I remembered all too well. "You're a financial risk," Lauren's recorded voice said. "If something happens to you, a fall, dementia, anything, we can't afford to take care of you. We have our own future to protect." I watched Lauren as she listened to herself. Her face had gone rigid, every muscle fighting to maintain composure. Beside her, Barbara stared at the table, refusing to look at the screen or at anyone in the room. The recording continued. Daniel's hollow agreement. Lauren's quotation of her mother's philosophy. The final demand that I leave on Christmas night, every word, every calculation, every cold dismissal, all of it preserved in digital clarity. "The recordings were edited," Lauren said suddenly, her voice cracking. "They had to be. I wouldn't have Lauren." Barbara's whisper cut through her daughter's protests. "Stop talking. You're making it worse." But Lauren couldn't stop. The dam had broken and words poured out in a desperate flood. "This is a setup. James planned this whole thing. He's always been manipulative. Mom told me that years ago. He pretends to be this humble teacher, but he's been hiding things, lying to all of us. How is that not manipulation? How is that not worse than anything I said?" Patricia Vance placed a hand on Lauren's arm, attempting to silence her client, but Lauren shook it off. "You don't understand," she continued, turning to face me directly. "You don't know what it's like to grow up with nothing, to watch your mother struggle, to know that security is the only thing that matters. I did what I had to do. I protected my family by throwing away mine," I said quietly. The words stopped her. She stared at me, mouth open, whatever response she had prepared dissolving before it could form. Barbara finally spoke, her voice controlled but tight. "James, let's be reasonable. Whatever mistakes were made, we're still family. Daniel and Lauren have a child together. Surely we can find some arrangement that benefits you." I finished. "That preserves access to assets you spent 15 years scheming to acquire." "That's not fair," Barbara said. But the conviction had drained from her voice. Thomas reached for the laptop and stopped the recording. The room fell into heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic far below. Then Daniel moved. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Tears were streaming down his face. Not the controlled tears of someone performing emotion, but the raw, uncontained weeping of a man who had reached the end of something he couldn't carry anymore. "Stop," he said, his voice breaking. "All of you, just stop." Everyone turned to look at him. Lauren's expression shifted from defiance to confusion to something approaching fear. She had never seen her husband like this, unscripted, uncontrolled, beyond her influence. "I need to say something." Daniel continued, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Something I should have said a long time ago. Something that changes everything." He looked at me, then at Lauren, then at the phone still resting on the table beside his empty chair. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "And Emily, if you're listening, I'm sorry to you too, but you both deserve to know the truth." The conference room seemed to contract around us, the air growing dense with anticipation. Daniel stood at the end of the table, tears still wet on his cheeks, his hands trembling at his sides. I had seen my son in many states over the years, joyful, frustrated, uncertain, afraid. But I had never seen him like this. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into waters whose depth he couldn't measure. "Dad," he began, his voice rough but steady. I've known about your money since before Mom died." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, their impact rippling outward through the room. Lauren's head snapped toward her husband, disbelief warring with dawning horror across her features. Barbara went very still, her hand frozen halfway to her purse. Even Thomas, who rarely showed surprise, allowed his eyebrows to rise slightly. Mom told me everything. Daniel continued, not looking at anyone except me. About the fund you started in 1987, about how it grew, about the trust she created and the conditions she attached to them. She told me 6 months before she died during one of our visits when Lauren was out shopping with Emily. He paused, swallowing hard, the memory clearly painful. She sat me down in the garden and she said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something about your father that you don't know. And I need you to promise me on everything you love, that you will never tell Lauren." I asked her why. Why keep it secret from my own wife? Daniel's gaze finally shifted to Lauren, and his expression hardened into something I had never seen on his face before. A cold clarity that stripped away all the softness I'd always associated with him. Mom said she had concerns about Lauren, about her character, about the way she looked at things and people. She said she hoped she was wrong, but if she wasn't, if Lauren was what Mom suspected, then keeping the secret would eventually reveal the truth. He took a shaky breath. She was right. Lauren had gone pale, her earlier defiance crumbling into something raw. "Daniel, what are you saying?" "What truth I needed to know," he said, his voice gaining strength. "If my wife loved me for who I am, or for what she thought she could get, if you believed I came from nothing, that my father was just a retired teacher living on Social Security, that there was no inheritance waiting, would you still treat him like family? Would you still treat me like a partner?" He stepped closer to her, and she shrank back in her chair. Christmas Eve was the test, Lauren, when Dad told us about his retirement, about his health concerns. I watched you. I watched your face change. I watched you calculate his worth in real time and find him wanting. I watched you push him out of our home on the coldest night of the year. And I said nothing. His voice cracked on the last words, guilt bleeding through the anger. I said nothing because I needed to see it. I needed to know for certain, beyond any doubt, what kind of woman I'd married. And you showed me. He was crying again now, but he didn't look away from her. "You didn't just fail a test, Lauren. You showed me exactly who you are. And worse, so much worse, you showed our daughter." Lauren's eyes widened, darting to Daniel's phone still resting on the table. Understanding crashed over her features. "Emily," she whispered. "You let Emily listen to this." "She deserved to know the truth," Daniel said. "About you, about your mother, about what kind of family she comes from. She's 12 years old and she already understood something was wrong. She asked Dad on Christmas Eve if it was true that he didn't have any money. She heard you say it. She's been carrying that confusion for a month." He turned away from Lauren, then turning to face me. The anger drained from his expression, replaced by something that looked like grief. The particular grief of a man confronting his own failures. "Daddy said I should have protected you that night when Lauren told you to leave. I should have stood up. I should have told her no. I should have walked out with you and driven you home and told her that if she couldn't treat my father with basic decency, she didn't deserve to be my wife." He was struggling to speak now, his words coming in fragments, between shuddering breaths. But I didn't. I was a coward. I chose to watch instead of act, to let you suffer so I could have my proof. I told myself it was necessary, that Mom would have understood, that the ends justified the means, but that's not true. Nothing justified letting you walk out into the snow alone on Christmas Eve. Nothing justified the look on your face when I didn't defend you. He met my eyes directly, and I saw something I hadn't seen in my son since he was a boy. Pure, unguarded honesty. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I don't deserve it. I just needed you to know that I see now. I see what I did and I see what it cost. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dad." The room fell silent. I looked at my son. Really looked at him for the first time in years. I had spent so long seeing him as Lauren's husband, as Emily's father, as the man who had drifted away from me into a life I couldn't reach. But standing before me now was the boy I had raised. The boy who used to ask me questions about history and morality and what it meant to live a good life. That boy had made terrible choices, had wounded me deeply. But he had also been fighting a battle I hadn't known about. He had been carrying Margaret's secret, testing his own marriage, watching his family fracture, while trying to understand if it could ever be made whole. Daniel, I began. But before I could continue, Lauren's voice shattered the moment. This is insane. She screamed, rising from her chair so violently it toppled backward. You all planned this together, you and your father, and that lawyer you set me up from the beginning. This whole marriage has been a trap. Barbara grabbed her purse and stood her face, a mask of controlled fury. Len, we're leaving now. She took her daughter's arm with a grip that looked painful. This meeting is over. Anything further can be communicated through our attorneys. She began pulling Lauren toward the door, but Lauren resisted, twisting back to face Daniel with wild eyes. You never loved me, she spat. You married me just to test me. Everything was a lie. Daniel shook his head slowly, sadly. No, Lauren. I married you because I loved you. I wanted the test to prove Mom wrong. I wanted you to be the person I hoped you were. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. You're the one who proved it was all a lie. Barbara stopped at the door, her hand on the frame, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. The mask of outrage she had worn moments ago dissolved, replaced by something more calculated, the look of a woman who had spent her entire life finding angles and wasn't ready to surrender even now. She released Lauren's arm and turned back to face the room. James, she said, her voice suddenly calm, almost pleasant. Let's be adults about this. Clearly, emotions are running high, and people have said things they probably regret. But at the end of the day, we're all practical people, aren't we? I remained seated, watching her approach, with the weariness of someone observing a snake they know to be venomous. Here's what I propose. She continued, positioning herself at the edge of the conference table as though she were presenting a business plan. Lauren and Daniel divorce. It happens. Marriages end. People move on. Lauren snorts, takes a reasonable settlement, something fair given her years of contribution to the household. We all sign non-disclosure agreements, walk away clean, and nobody's dirty laundry gets aired in public. No lawyers beyond what's necessary, no publicity, no drama. Everyone protects their reputation. She smiled, the expression precise and hollow. You get your son back. Daniel gets a fresh start. Lauren gets enough to rebuild her life. And I go back to Arizona knowing that my daughter isn't going to be destroyed over a misunderstanding that got out of hand. She spread her hands in a gesture of reasonableness. Everyone wins, James. Isn't that better than this circus? I looked at this woman, this architect of manipulation, who had spent 15 years engineering my family's destruction, and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not hatred, but a profound and clarifying pity. She genuinely believed that everything could be reduced to transactions, that human relationships were simply deals waiting to be negotiated. She couldn't conceive of a world where some things mattered more than outcomes. Barbara, I said, quietly, this was never about money. Her smile faltered. It was never about settlements or non-disclosure agreements or protecting reputations. It was about truth. I stood slowly, using the motion to emphasize my words. The truth of who my daughter-in-law really is. The truth of who you raised her to be. The truth of what you both thought you could take from my family while pretending to be part of it. I walked toward her, and she took an involuntary step backward. You can't negotiate your way out of truth, Barbara. You can't sign an agreement that makes the last 15 years disappear. Lauren said what she said. You wrote what you wrote. And now everyone who matters knows exactly what kind of people you are. Barbara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension, small, uncertain, and devastating in its clarity. Mommy. The word came from Daniel's phone, still connected on the conference table. Emily's voice, thin with confusion and pain, filled the room like a ghost suddenly made visible. Mommy, did you really say those things about Grandpa? Did you really want him to go away? Lauren spun toward the phone, her face contorting through shock, horror, and desperation in rapid succession. Her mouth worked silently, searching for words that wouldn't come. For the first time since I'd known her, Lauren Hale had nothing to say. Emily, baby, she finally managed, her voice cracking. You don't understand. Grown-up conversations are complicated. I heard the recording, Emily said. And there was something harder in her voice now, something that hadn't been there before. I heard you say Grandpa was a risk. I heard you say he was extra weight. I heard you tell him to leave on Christmas. Sweetheart, please. Why, Mommy? The question came out small and broken. Why did you want to throw Grandpa away? He's never been mean to anyone. He tells me stories about Grandma. He remembers my birthday every year. He's my grandpa. Lauren was crying now. Mascara-streaked tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached toward the phone as though she could somehow touch her daughter through the device. Emily, I love you. I love you so much. You have to understand, do you love Grandpa? The question hung in the air, simple and unanswerable. Lauren couldn't respond. The silence stretched and stretched, damning in its emptiness. Barbara stood frozen near the door, watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. I could see the calculation draining from her eyes, replaced by the hollow recognition of total defeat. Her daughter was sobbing. Her granddaughter was asking questions that had no good answers. Her scheme, 15 years in the making, had unraveled completely, and there was nothing she could do to stitch it back together. Emily's voice came again, quieter this time, directed at Daniel. Daddy, can I live with Grandpa sometimes when things are hard at home? Daniel picked up the phone, cradling it gently, as though holding something precious. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? Because he never made me feel like a liability, Emily said. He never made me feel like I cost too much or took up too much space. He just made me feel like I was enough. I turned away from the scene, walking to the window that overlooked the snow-covered courtyard. Behind me, I heard Lauren collapse into a chair, heard Barbara's sharp intake of breath, heard Daniel murmuring reassurances to his daughter through the phone, the sounds of a family breaking apart and perhaps beginning to reform into something different. 1 week later, Daniel filed for legal separation. The paperwork was straightforward, irreconcilable differences, standard custody arrangements pending final divorce proceedings. Thomas handled the details with his usual efficiency, ensuring that the trust conditions were formally documented and that Lauren's forfeit of benefits was legally recorded. Lauren fought at first, threatening countersuits and public exposure, but her attorney quietly advised her that the evidence against her was overwhelming. The recordings alone would destroy her in any custody hearing. The emails between her and Barbara would demolish whatever remained. On February the 1st, she packed 2 suitcases and drove to the airport. Barbara had already returned to Arizona 3 days earlier, leaving without saying goodbye to her daughter or her granddaughter. Their relationship, built on strategy rather than love, couldn't survive the failure of their shared enterprise. Lauren flew back to Phoenix alone. She moved into a small apartment her mother refused to visit. The house in Denver, the business she had been building, the life she'd carefully constructed, all of it remained behind artifacts of a plan that had crumbled to dust. Daniel and Emily stayed in Colorado, and slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild. March arrived with the slow thaw of Colorado winter ice, retreating from sidewalks and bare trees, beginning to show the first hints of green. The legal separation was finalized on the 12th, a quiet proceeding in a family court that had seen thousands of marriages dissolve across its polished wooden benches. Daniel received primary custody of Emily, with Lauren granted supervised visitation rights pending a psychological evaluation that her attorney had unsuccessfully argued against. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, had listened to the recordings and reviewed the emails and rendered her decision without dramatic pronouncement. Justice, I was learning, rarely announced itself with fanfare. It simply arrived, settled into place, and let consequences unfold at their own pace. Lauren's reputation did not collapse in a single spectacular moment. There was no public scandal, no headline in the Denver Post, no viral social media exposure. Instead, her downfall came through whispered truths passed between colleagues and acquaintances, the quiet erosion of a carefully constructed image. Friends who had once admired her ambition began declining lunch invitations. Business partners who had praised her strategic thinking started returning calls more slowly than not at all. The consulting firm she had built with such determination began losing clients not through any formal accusation, but through the accumulated weight of people who had heard something, knew someone who knew the story, decided they preferred to work with someone whose character wasn't in question. By the end of March, she had closed the Denver office and retreated fully to Phoenix, where Barbara waited with something other than maternal comfort. Thomas maintained contacts in Arizona who kept him informed of developments, and he shared them with me during our weekly dinners, a ritual we had established in the aftermath of the confrontation, a way of processing everything that had happened while maintaining the friendship that had sustained us both for decades. Barbara's reputation is suffering, he told me over steaks at a restaurant we both liked. The story has spread through real estate circles. People are connecting dots. The previous daughters, the previous marriages, the pattern of targeting wealthy families. No one trusts her judgment anymore. She's been asked to resign from 2 charity boards. I took no pleasure in this. Barbara Hale had engineered her own destruction through choices made freely over many years. Her consequences were simply the natural result of seeds she had planted long before I became aware of her existence. And Lauren living in a small apartment in Scottsdale. Barbara refuses to let her stay at the house. Apparently there was quite a confrontation. Thomas shook his head. Barbara told her, "You had one job, one simple job, and you ruined everything I spent years building." I set down my fork, the food suddenly less appealing. She blames Lauren for the failure, not herself. People like Barbara never blame themselves, Thomas said. In her mind, the plan was perfect. The execution was flawed. Lauren was supposed to be her masterpiece, and instead Lauren became evidence of her methods. I thought about Lauren alone in that apartment, rejected by the mother who had shaped her into an instrument of acquisition, separated from the daughter she had claimed to be protecting, watching everything she had worked for dissolve. It would have been easy to feel satisfaction to see her suffering as justice served. But I found I couldn't. She was a broken person, raised by a broken person. And while her choices had been cruel, the architecture of her cruelty had been built by someone else. Daniel came to see me at the penthouse on a Saturday afternoon in late March. He looked different than he had during the confrontation, the thinner, older, but also somehow cleaner, as though a weight he had carried for years had finally been set down. We sat in the living room beneath Margaret's portrait coffee, cooling between us, and talked about practical matters for a while. Emily's adjustment to the new custody arrangement, the logistics of moving into a smaller house, the details of daily life after catastrophe. Then Daniel set down his cup and looked at me directly. "Dad, I need to know where we stand. Not legally, not practically, just as father and son. Can you ever forgive me for what I did?" I'd thought about this question many times since January. I had turned it over in my mind during sleepless nights and quiet mornings, examining it from every angle. The answer I had reached was neither simple nor complete, but it was honest. I forgive you, Daniel, I said. But son, forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. Forgiveness is a decision I can make in a moment. Trust is something that has to be rebuilt over time through consistent action, through choices that prove you've changed. He nodded slowly, accepting this. We start today, I continued. We start with honesty, with presence, with showing up for each other even when it's difficult. We start with small things and let them accumulate into something larger. I'm not going to pretend the past didn't happen, but I'm also not going to let it prevent us from building a future. Daniel's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. I understand, Dad. I have a lot of work to do, and I'm going to do it. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. He told me then that he had resigned from the company Lauren had invested in a marketing firm where her connections had secured his position. He had found new work instead, a junior role at a nonprofit organization focused on veteran services. The salary was less than half what he had been making. The prestige was non-existent, but it was honest work earned through his own qualifications rather than his wife's schemes. It feels right, he said. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm building something that belongs to me. That evening, after Daniel had left to pick up Emily from a friend's house, I walked through the penthouse alone. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the floors. Margaret had chosen the art she had selected, the life we had built together in this space we rarely used but always cherished. I found myself standing before the antique desk in the study, the one Margaret had inherited from her grandmother and treasured above all our other possessions. There was a drawer in that desk, a small one tucked beneath the writing surface, that she had told me never to open until everything was finished. You'll know when she had said, smiling, that enigmatic smile I had loved for 40 years. And when you know, you'll find what you need. I pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside, resting on velvet lining that Margaret had installed herself, was a leather journal I had never seen before. Her handwriting marked the cover for James when the time is right. I carried the journal to the leather chair by the window, the same chair where Margaret used to sit in the early mornings, watching the city wake up while she drank her tea. The leather had worn soft over the years, shaped by the countless hours she had spent there, and settling into it felt like being held by something familiar. My hands trembled as I opened the cover. Margaret's handwriting filled every page, that graceful script I had loved since the first note she passed me in our college library 43 years ago. But this was different from her casual letters or the observations she jotted in her daily journals. This was meticulous, organized, dated, a comprehensive document that must have taken months or even years to compile. The first page bore a simple heading for James when everything is finished. Beneath it, she had written, "My darling, if you're reading this, then the storm has passed. The truth has emerged. Our son has made his choice, and now you need to understand how we arrived here and why I couldn't tell you while I was still breathing beside you." I turned the page and found myself looking at a timeline, dates stretching back 6 years, each one annotated with observations and predictions. Lauren's name appeared throughout, accompanied by notes on her behavior, her patterns, the subtle tells that Margaret had cataloged with the precision of a scientist documenting a new species. November 12th, one entry read, "Noticed Elle watching James count cash for the gardener. Her eyes track the bills like a cat watching a bird. She doesn't look at Daniel that way, only at indicators of wealth." Another entry, February 3rd. Elle asked about our retirement plans 3 times during dinner. Framed as concern for our health actually mapping our financial trajectory, she's calculating timeline to inheritance. Page after page revealed the depth of Margaret's observation. She had mapped everything, how Lauren would likely react to perceived financial pressure, the probable escalation of her demands, the point at which she would cross from subtle manipulation into open hostility. She had predicted Barbara's involvement with chilling accuracy, noting that Lauren's behavior pattern suggested external coaching from someone with more experience, and she had understood Daniel's weakness with the clear-eyed love of a mother who refused to look away from her child's flaws. "Daniel wants to believe the best in people," she wrote. "It's one of his finest qualities and his greatest vulnerability. He will make excuses for Lauren until the evidence becomes undeniable. He will choose peace over truth until peace is no longer possible. But underneath that avoidance lives the boy. We raised a boy who knows right from wrong, who values family, who will ultimately choose courage if given no other option." I found the passage I'd been searching for without knowing it, written in slightly larger letters as though Margaret wanted to ensure I wouldn't miss it. "James, I know you're reading this after everything has fallen apart and rebuilt itself. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. But some lessons can only be learned through experience by you and by Daniel. If I had simply told you what I suspected about Lauren, you would have confronted the situation directly. You would have demanded honesty, forced a crisis, and given Daniel someone else to blame for his wife's exposure. He would never have been forced to see the truth himself, to make his own choice, to discover his own courage. Some revelations only mean something when they're earned." Tears were falling, now blurring the words. But I kept reading. Near the end of the journal, Margaret had written about a charity event she attended 6 years before her death, a fundraiser for a children's hospital where Arizona donors mingled with Colorado philanthropists. Barbara Hale had been there representing some real estate consortium, and Margaret had found herself seated beside her during the silent auction. Within one conversation, Margaret wrote, "I recognized exactly what she was. The way she evaluated everyone in the room, calculating their worth, the way she mentioned her daughter's marriage to a lovely young man from a good Colorado family. The pride in her voice when she described how she had guided her daughters toward appropriate matches. She saw me as a fellow strategist, James. She assumed I would understand. She was so confident in her own cleverness that she couldn't imagine anyone seeing through it. The trust, I realized, had never been about punishment. Margaret had designed it as a mirror, a way to reflect Lauren and Barbara's true natures back at them, but more importantly, a way to show Daniel who he had married. The conditions weren't traps, they were opportunities. Chances for people to reveal their characters through their own freely chosen actions. This was never about revenge, my love, the final pages read. Revenge is for people who have been defeated. I was never defeated. I simply ran out of time. This was about showing our son the truth of who he married and giving him the courage to choose again. The conditions of the trust ensured that if Lauren ever showed her true colors, there would be consequences. But more than that, they ensured that Daniel would have to see those colors for himself. No denial, no excuses, no blaming his father for being paranoid. The very last paragraph was dated just weeks before she died. The handwriting slightly shakier but still clear. If Daniel chose family over convenience, he would be saved. If he chose Lauren's path, at least you would know the truth about your son, and you could protect yourself accordingly. Either way, I protected you both. Either way, my love continued working, even after my heart stopped beating. That's what marriage means to me, James. Not until death do his part, but far, far beyond it." I closed the journal and held it against my chest. The city lights were coming on outside the window, Denver transforming into a constellation of glowing windows and moving headlights. Somewhere out there, Daniel was making dinner for Emily, beginning the slow work of becoming the father he should have been all along. Somewhere in Arizona, Lauren was confronting the emptiness of a life built on calculation. And here in this chair that still held the shape of my wife's body, I wept. Not from sadness, not from grief, but from the overwhelming, devastating, beautiful depth of a love that had seen everything coming and prepared for it anyway. Margaret had given me one final gift, the knowledge that I had never faced any of this alone. She had been beside me the entire time, guiding from beyond the grave, loving me in ways I was only now beginning to understand. The snow began falling just after sunset, soft flakes drifting past the penthouse windows like whispered secrets. I sat in the leather chair by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds I had longed for during all those quiet months alone. Emily's laughter as she examined her presents, Daniel's voice warm with a contentment I hadn't heard in years. 1 year had passed since that other Christmas, the one that had broken everything open so it could finally be healed. The world had turned its full circle. And here we were again on December 25th. But nothing was the same. Everything was better. Daniel's divorce had been finalized in September. The proceedings were mercifully brief, Lauren having abandoned any pretense of fighting for custody. Once it became clear that the evidence against her would be presented in open court, she had signed the papers without contest, taken a modest settlement that Thomas had negotiated down to a fraction of what she once demanded, and disappeared from our lives with the silence of someone who had finally run out of strategies. My son sat on the floor now, helping Emily assemble a complicated robotics kit she had requested for Christmas. His new job at the Veterans Nonprofit paid less than a third of his old salary, but I'd never seen him more at peace. He came home tired but satisfied, full of stories about the people he helped, the small victories that accumulated into something meaningful. The prestigious marketing career was gone, along with the expensive suits and the constant anxiety of maintaining a life built on someone else's ambitions. In its place was something humbler and far more valuable work that belonged to him, earned through his own merit, untainted by schemes or connections. Emily lived with Daniel during the week and spent weekends with me at the penthouse. The arrangement had evolved naturally without lawyers or formal schedules, simply two generations learning to be family again. She had her own room here, now decorated with posters of her favorite bands and photographs of Margaret that I had framed for her. Sometimes I heard her talking to those photographs late at night, telling her grandmother about school and friends and the small adventures of a 13-year-old life. I never interrupted. Some conversations are sacred. Thomas had shared news of Lauren. Occasionally fragments gathered through his Arizona contacts. She lived alone now in a small apartment in Phoenix, working as an administrative assistant at a real estate firm that had no idea about her history. Barbara had severed all contact within weeks of the confrontation. Her final words to her daughter, preserved in a voicemail that Lauren had apparently saved: "You cost me everything I built, me. You're not my daughter. You're my biggest failure." I thought about that sometimes, about the particular cruelty of a mother who could reduce her child to an investment that had failed to mature. Lauren had spent her entire life being shaped into an instrument of acquisition, praised when she succeeded, discarded when she didn't. She had never been loved. She had only ever been useful. And now, stripped of usefulness, she had discovered the hollow core of her existence. A woman in her late 30s, alone in an empty apartment, finally understanding that the family she had tried to exploit was more real than the one she had been born into. I didn't feel satisfaction at her fate. I felt something closer to sorrow, the particular sadness of watching someone realize too late that they had been cheated of something essential. She had been a victim before she became a perpetrator, and while that didn't excuse her choices, it did explain them. Emily finished connecting the final piece of her robotics kit and looked up with triumph. "Grandpa, it works. Look." The small robot wheeled across the floor lights, blinking, making sounds that were supposed to approximate speech. She guided it with a controller, steering it toward my chair, her face glowing with the pure joy of accomplishment. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said. "Your grandmother would have loved to see this. She always believed you'd be an engineer." Emily's expression softened. She abandoned the robot and came to sit on the arm of my chair, leaning against me the way she used to when she was smaller. "Grandpa, can you read me something from Grandma's journal, the part you showed me before?" I reached for the leather journal I kept on the side table. Now its pages worn from frequent handling. I opened it to the passage I had marked and read aloud. "Real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about who stays when staying is hard. It's about choosing each other over and over again. Even when choosing is costly, even when walking away would be easier. That's what makes family sacred. Not the accidents of birth, but the deliberate acts of love." Emily was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall past the windows. Then she looked up at me with Margaret's eyes. Margaret's curiosity. Margaret's capacity for questions that cut straight to the heart. "Grandpa, do you think Grandma can see us right now?" I looked at my granddaughter, at my son still sitting on the floor, surrounded by wrapping paper, at the portrait above the fireplace, where Margaret's painted smile seemed warmer than ever. I looked out at the snow falling over Denver, the city lights glowing far below the world, continuing its turning while we sat here together, finally whole. "She never left, sweetheart. I said she's been here the whole time. She just needed us to find our way back to each other. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people who were supposed to love us most." James Caldwell walked into his son's home on Christmas Eve expecting warmth and family, and instead discovered that he had been reduced to a line item on someone else's balance sheet. But what Lauren and Barbara never understood, what people like them can never understand, is that true wealth has nothing to do with money. It lives in the bonds we build, the trust we honor, and the love we choose to give even when giving is hard. Margaret saw the storm coming years before it arrived, and she prepared not for revenge, but for truth. She understood that some lessons can only be learned through experience, that some revelations only matter when they're earned. Her gift to James wasn't protection from pain. It was the assurance that he would never face that pain alone. And in the end, the family that Lauren tried to destroy became stronger than it had ever been. Not because they won, but because they chose each other. Over and over again, they chose each other. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Perhaps someone who has felt discarded by the people they trusted, or someone who is struggling to believe that justice still exists in this world. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever experienced a moment when the truth finally came to light? How did it change you? Your stories matter, and I would be honored to hear them. Thank you for staying until the very end. Did you enjoy my story? What a journey it has been. I truly wonder, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, or would you have done what I did to reclaim your dignity? Let's meet in the comments below. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. I'm reading every single one. Which city are you listening from tonight? If my story resonated with you, you can support me and help me bring more stories like this to the world by sending a super thanks. Your sweet support means the world to me and allows me to continue this journey with all of you. On the screen now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There are so many more on my channel, each with its own lessons and triumphs. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for being here with me.